Welcome to week 2 in our series, God Shapes Us, a series on spiritual formation, on how God transforms us into the people that we were meant to be. And it's very deliberate that we're talking about this series in terms of God shapes us. Because although there are certainly things that we can do, practices that we can initiate, disciplines that we can follow in order to open ourselves to spiritual transformation, in order to open ourselves to God working in us. The truth is, and the truth that we always need to hold in front of ourselves, is that this is God's work. God is the one who's really doing all of the heavy lifting. We can cooperate with that. We can open ourselves to God's work. Indeed, we need to open ourselves to God's work in us. But the main thing is this is God. This is God transforming our lives. And last week we opened up with the reality that all of us have desires, or have impulses toward things that we know aren't good for us. In traditional Christian language, we have a desire to sin, to do those things that would be harmful to us and sometimes even harmful to others. And the way that our spiritual transformation starts is by God working in us to move our desire more toward Him, to create in us that desire to follow Christ and to live in His ways. And God helps us even with that desire to start moving in that direction. And this week, it's kind of the second step, because all of us realize too that there are things about ourselves that hold us back from having the best life possible. You know, maybe it's, and a lot of these things, they really aren't our fault. I mean, they're part of the result of maybe the way we were brought up or different experiences that we had. It's not really our fault that these things happen to us, but they do tend to shape us in certain ways. I mean, if you grew up in a home where your parents always fought, that shapes you in a particular way. It makes you have certain ways of being likely to relate to other people. And that has to be kind of overcome in order to have the fullest life possible. And some people just have personality traits. You know, sometimes people are called stubborn, you know, that they have their own ideas and they're not going to listen to anybody else. And is that somebody's fault, really? Well, I don't know. But I do know this, that these sorts of things, these sorts of personality traits, or the things that are the result of the way that we were raised or our life experiences, you know, if somebody has a lot of life experience where family members and friends and coworkers have betrayed them and been hurtful to them, that's going to make it difficult for that person to trust. Now, is that their fault? I think we would hesitate to say that that's their fault. But the reality is that these things are not possible to overcome through sheer willpower. You know, it's like addictions. You can't, most people, there are some people who through sheer willpower can break an addiction. But most people, it's not really an option. You know, AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, has some wisdom. You know, they say, we admitted that we were powerless over alcohol and our lives had become unmanageable. Well, take alcohol out and put in, you know, fill in the blank for each of us. There's something in each of our lives that makes things unmanageable, whether it's an addiction or whether it's a personality trait or whether it's a way that we look at the world based on our life experience. There are things about ourselves that it's really, really hard to change through sheer willpower. But see, the good news is that Jesus wants us to have that kind of full life, that Jesus wants us to be whole, to have abundant life, to feel connected with God and to feel connected with one another. And the way that we do that, the way that we make that step in that direction, is to trust God. You know, we really don't need more resources, more money, more friends, more activities. We need more Jesus. We need a deeper connection with God. We need to trust God. trusting God really is the one thing. It's the one thing that our willpower can do. We can decide to trust God, to move into that space where we will trust God to change us and to help us see the world and experience the world in new ways. You know, trusting God is really the most powerful thing that we can do. And there's plenty of stories in the Bible that really illustrate this point. If you think of the story of Elijah the prophet, when he goes to visit the widow of Zarephath. Now, there's a famine in the land. Everybody's starving. And Elijah goes to visit this widow. And all she has left is a little bit of meal and a little tiny bit of oil. That's it. And in fact, as Elijah shows up, she's thinking, my son and I have nothing. I'm just going to make one little cake for us to eat, and then we'll lay down and die because there's no hope. And Elijah comes up to her and he says, you know, what you could do for me is, why don't you make me a little cake and then make something for yourself, because God is going to take care of you. Now the widow knows how little she has, but she decides to just trust God. And you know how the story works out. The widow trusts God, and the meal doesn't run out, and the oil doesn't run out, and they make it. She and her son make it through the famine. They survive, even with the little bit of almost nothing that they had, because they trusted God. That changed everything. You know, and that's the way it is in so many places in the Bible. You know, there's the time where Jesus and his disciples are ministering to people. They're working really hard, and the disciples are, we're tired, and Jesus says, come on, we're going to go off. We're going to take a little break. It'll be just me and you. We'll have a rest from the crowds. And they take off, but the crowds are smart. They know where Jesus is headed. They know where the disciples are headed. So they beat him there. And the crowd's waiting for them when they get off the boat. And Jesus looks at them, and now they're not just a crowd of people that have illnesses and other needs, but now they're hungry on top of that. And so the disciples say to Jesus, you got to send these people away to the surrounding villages so that they can go and get some food for themselves. And Jesus says, why don't you give them something to eat? And the disciples are like, we got 5 little loaves of bread and 2 fish. How's that going to work? But they turn it over to Jesus. And you know how that story ends too. Jesus blesses the loaves and the fish, and there's enough for everyone. Because they trusted God. And it's the same thing in our own lives. It's making that move to trust God. To believe that God can actually change us, that God can actually help us to not just be different, but to live differently. God says to us, it seems to you that you have so little. It seems to you that you just can't make progress. He says, surrender to me and see what you will have. God invites us to trust. That's what we do. That's what we can do. We can trust. Henry Nouwen tells the story of the Flying Rodleys. They're trapeze artists. And one time, some friends of Henry Nouwen's invited him and his father to go and see the Flying Rodleys at a circus. And Nouwen was just amazed. It's the elegance of ballet 100 feet in the air. It's completely incredible. And so he starts to talk with the Flying Rodleys, starts to talk to these people, and he establishes a friendship with them. And they say, hey, why don't you travel around with us? You can see us practice. You can see some more of our shows. You can see exactly how it is that we put this together. And so he does that. And one day he's talking to the leader of the group, and Rodley says, everybody thinks that I'm the star. that the flyer is the star. But the reality is that it's the catcher who does all of the hard work. It's all about the catcher. And now it's like, well, what do you mean? What do you mean? How does that work? And Rodley says, the catcher is the one that we completely rely on. The flyer doesn't do anything. If I were to try to grab Joe's wrist, my catcher, we would probably both end up falling. I might break his wrist. I might miss. All I can do as the flyer is trust Joe to catch me. That's my job. That's it. And now I thought, wow, is that not as it is with us and God? All we need to do is trust God to catch us, to trust God to work in our lives. The hard work is not really ours to do. The hard work is ours to accept. We can make that decision to trust. We can take that step closer to God's presence. We can open ourselves up to God's transformation. We can allow ourselves to be caught. Thanks be to God.